Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our participants from Asia, Europe, and beyond. Welcome to the second day of the Asia Europe Environment Forum annual conference on the topic of creating an enabling environment for SDG 12 in Awesome. Before we begin, and we have two very interesting sessions for today, I have a few guidelines to ensure that you have a smooth experience in using the conference platform that we have called Huva for today and tomorrow. So if you're accessing it on your desktop, at the very center of your screen, you can see the live stream link. And if you scroll down, you will see the relevant session information. On the right-hand side, you will see three streams. One is for Q&A, questions and answers, where at any time you can type in your questions for the panelists. And on the chat is for anything else, where you can chat with other participants, or if you have anything that you would like to communicate to the organizers. And on the third screen, you have the community section, where we see that a lot of people have already started topical discussions on the different streams and the different topics that are covered in this conference. And then, as we go through the agenda of the conference, I will come on to close each session and invite everyone to go to the next agenda item. And you can do this by clicking on Show Agenda, which is just right on top of the live stream link. In regards to timing, we will endeavor to begin and to end each sessions promptly in consideration for those who are only tuning in for particular sessions. If we are ahead of time, we will initiate a break. And if we are over time, we will communicate with the moderator or the session coordinator to wrap up. And for the speakers who are already watching on Huva for the next session, please log into our backstage half an hour before the session. And finally, rest assured that after the conference, all recorded videos of all sessions will be uploaded here on Huva, and all PowerPoint presentations, if any, from the speakers will also be made available to all registered participants. And so that's it for me. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to the chair of our first session on inclusive food value chains as a way of transition to circular economy, Mr. Clemens Groenbruhel. Clemens, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fatima. That's very kind of you. And welcome everyone to this session on inclusive food value chains as a way of transition to circular economy. So what are we going to talk about? Basically, I already gave my introduction yesterday at the conference, so I'm not going to repeat myself too much. What we want to hear mostly today is from our panelists, and we have an exquisite panel selected for you today. Basically, what we're trying to cover is looking at food systems from a systems perspective, from the farmer all the way to consumer, and how to introduce the concepts of sustainable consumption and production, and also circularity into the food system in order to make it more sustainable. And I think what we'll also very much do is to focus on the role of the farmer, and in that also the role of the female farmer, in order to work with them as partners and stakeholders, how to sort of set up the food system in a completely new way, so we can achieve sort of more sustainable production and consumption. The panel for today, as I mentioned, very exquisite. We have Erin Sweeney from Grow Asia. I'll introduce them separately a bit later on. We have Santosh Singh from Intellicap. We have Christina Egenta from WWF Indonesia, and we have Andrew Powell, who is from Asia Biobusiness. I'd like to ask the panelists first to give a bit of an opening statement, just to give a flavor of where do they come from, and what is their take on sustainable food systems. And then we'll go into some specific questions that we have prepared and worked on together. Those questions, as I mentioned, are pre-prepared, and I'll call on some of the panelists to respond to those questions, as well as then sort of upon the completing those questions, we'll go into a more open question and answer. And I'd like to ask the participants to put their questions into the Q&A box, what Fatima just explained. So you can put them in both the chat and the Q&A box, but it's easier for us to see it if you put your questions in the Q&A box for the Q&A section, which is the latter half of this panel. All right. What is the outcome of all this? We have prepared a policy brief, and there is a draft form of this policy brief already online, and my colleague will put a link of this policy brief into the chat right now, so you can have a look at it. But we'll add to that, based on what we find out on this panel today. We will also put up a little bit later a thing called Mural, where we look at what are the policies that we would like to keep, what works well, what are we going to discard because it works against sustainability, what are we going to scale up because it works well but it's not widespread yet, and also what are we going to improve on. So this mural will be put up a bit later on, and this is based on inputs that we have received from participants earlier, sort of prior to this conference. So it's all very participatory, but in the end we hope to get a good statement on how to improve sustainable food systems, inclusive food systems, and it'll be sort of from a multi-stakeholder perspective. So hopefully it'll also be sort of read and listened to. So without further ado, I'd like to call upon our panelists one by one. First up is Erin Sweeney. Erin is a manager at Grow Asia. She's a manager for sustainable business and investment. And Grow Asia is a multi-stakeholder partnership that catalyzes action on inclusive agriculture development in Southeast Asia. Erin leads the implementation of the action plan for the ASEAN guidelines on responsible agricultural investments. I think those guidelines came out about a year ago, as far as I remember. They were presented at the Responsible Business Forum. And she's also in charge of gender mainstreaming initiatives. And Erin is an urban planner. Ironically, now she'll be talking about rural issues, but also specializing on food systems policy, and has worked and lived in the United States, South America, South Asia, and the Caribbean, and I assume also Southeast Asia. So Erin, can I get your statement very quickly? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Clemens, and thank you so much for the invitation to join this exciting discussion here today. And of course, I'm thrilled to be joining such experts from the region. Just to say that I've always encouraged people to think more broadly about urban planning, that urban planners should always be thinking about where our food comes from, which is still predominantly from rural spaces. So I'll kick off my comments today by just painting a quick picture of broad trends in Asia that we're seeing in sustainable agriculture and consumption, and share a little bit about what Grow Asia is doing in this space. And then later in the session, I'll give very specific examples from our organization to really highlight these trends. We know that by 2050, Asia's population will double its spending on food to over $8 trillion. So that's by 2030. And this is according to the Asia Food Challenge report published last year. We also know that, particularly in light of COVID-19, Asian consumers are increasingly interested in knowing where their food comes from and how it got to them. So looking at sustainable, traceable supply chains. And we know that this trend will force the region's 100 million smallholder farmers to professionalize and adopt new technologies and practices. And we here at Grow Asia believe that those current trends will lead to a cadre of younger, better farmers who can really meet that demand from Asian consumers. So we run initiatives that aim to drive more sustainable practices among smallholder farmers in the region, improve productivity and yield for those farmers, and then encourage public policy that's supportive of these goals. And we do that by forming these private-public producer partnerships. We were catalyzed by the World Economic Forum in 2015 under this premise that multi-stakeholder platforms could achieve results at scale. And Grow Asia has managed through a network of 6 different in-country offices to reach 1.8 million smallholder farmers around the region. And our model is really to bring together those different actors to develop interventions that are locally relevant and contextualized, and that are going to be able to scale up over time. So we are very often looking at projects with tens of thousands of smallholder farmers engaged. And we do that by always leading our interventions by identifying a very clear market demand for a specific agri-commodity or crop in the region, and then bringing together the right partners to the table to assess the challenges and then address them with specific interventions. The one thing I'd like to leave everything with before I pass it on is just that we're learning as a network that in order to shift sustainable agricultural practices, in order to incentivize smallholder farmers to take up more sustainable production methods, good agricultural practices, or good environmental practices, those smallholder farming communities need access to capital. And they need access to capital at rates much higher than many MFIs or DFIs will be able to really produce. So as an organization, we hope to drive agribusiness and financial investors to inject cash into rural economies and allow farmers to take advantage of this plethora of higher quality inputs and ag tech solutions that we see emerging in the market. We know that there is an $800 billion investment opportunity in Asia's agri-food sector over the next 10 years. And we as a network continue to ask ourselves how we can make sure that those investments drive more sustainable, responsible practices, and in light of COVID-19, allow us to build back better. And as I said, I'll be very pleased to share specific examples from the network when we move into the question section. Thanks so much, Clemens.
That's wonderful, Erin. Thank you very much, and I hope those immense sums are all invested sustainably and responsibly. I should say also that we are missing, unfortunately, one panelist. There was supposed to be an additional one, Oma Kaing. Unfortunately, she had a family emergency. So contrary to the agenda and the names on the panelists, there's one missing. And I hope she's doing all right, or her family is. Next, I'd like to invite Santosh Singh. Santosh is leading the agriculture, energy, and climate change practice at Intellicap. He has more than 15 years of experience in base of pyramid market development with a focus on energy access, climate resilient agriculture, climate finance. Before joining Intellicap, Santosh was working with the World Bank, GIZ, and Tata Trust, and focused on developing affordable clean energy, access solutions, and climate finance interventions. Santosh, welcome. And if you could give us a short statement on where you're coming from as regards to inclusive food systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to all the participants and who are watching this session. So before I kind of give you my opening remark, just a couple of lines that what we have been doing in this space and what Intellicap does. We are part of Aviskar group, and our focus is solving some of the biggest development problems through entrepreneurship and supporting entrepreneurs. And agriculture has been one of the core focus areas for us. And we have, as a group, invested in a number of kind of interventions which focus on circularity and improving the agriculture systems, sustainability as well as productivity. So we have a good understanding of what it takes to create sustainable enterprises who can basically be scaled up, and and we do it through investment. Intellicap builds the ecosystem, so solve some of the major problems through entrepreneurship. And that's the vantage point I would take to kind of give you my thoughts on circularity, sustainability, and smallholder farmers. But before I go into those things, a couple of data points to kind of highlight what we are talking about. Uh, 90% of the world's farms are small farms. So it's a very, very kind of critical number that we focus on them. At the same time, if you look at the small farms and where they are primarily into sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. So these two regions need to be kind of at the forefront of transition. And looking at the circularity, sustainability, and the responsible consumption part of the equation, 1/5 of the GHG emission comes from agriculture, and more prominently, 40 to 41% of methane emission comes from agriculture. So they have a huge footprint. At the same time, due to climate change and kind of all the challenges, the productivity of agriculture sector is at threat, and we are kind of seeing a 20 to 30% loss of productivity. At the same time, we are also looking at increased demand for food, which is creating a very, very unique challenge for us to address all of this. And if you throw another number, that when we talk about responsible consumption, the total amount of food waste we are talking about is roughly around 1.3 billion tons, which can alone feed almost 800 million people globally. So when we talk about circularity, one of the major things is to kind of reduce waste. Now, in all of that, the point that we have been focusing on, that smallholder farmers are going to play a critical role. And they can play a critical role by, one, transforming their own practices, as well as taking a larger role in the value chain. So focusing on the production side, and I'll come back to the consumption side later. On the production side, the smallholder farmers have been kind of doing the legacy practices and trying to kind of improve their productivity with whatever methods we are suggesting, but they are not necessarily a kind of averse to moving towards a sustainable or responsible production system. What is stopping them is that there is a cost to that transition. The farmers need to put upfront investment to transition to responsible or sustainable production, and most of the farmers cannot afford that because they are not able to put that upfront investment. Now, if you look at the upfront investment, in order to make that investment profitable, you need to leverage the market better. You need to kind of sell the produce at a higher price. You need a better access to market. And this requires a fair bit of challenge for smallholder farmers, considering the size of their farms and the kind of muscle power they have to bargain with the market. Unless and until you organize them, you put them in a structure, they won't be able to leverage the market. So one major challenge we see in the transition is how the market can be leveraged to work for the smallholder farmers. The second challenge we see that while we talk about sustainable production, and everybody has agreed that sustainable production has enormous benefit for humanity at large, but the costs are confined to the producers. Unless and until we spread the cost over value chain, especially with the consumers, we need consumers to step up and pay for that sustainable product that they are getting. If that is not happening, the farmers would have no incentive to kind of move toward that. So one of the key things that we see is focus on the customer awareness for them to pay premium to the products that they're getting, because they are getting more, thing. So, just to leave you the last thought, that if you want to kind of make the smallholder farmers lead the transition to sustainable production, what we need to focus on the three things. A, we need a favorable policy regime that incentivizes them. B, we need a kind of mechanism that put the smallholder farmers in a position that they can leverage the market better. Third, we need to have the customer realize that sustainable production, responsible consumption, or anything that has a transition cost, they need to bear that cost as well. It's not going to be only the producer going to bear the cost. So how to kind of make the customer aware? Now, one of the things that I want to leave you with is that when we talk about these farmers, they are quite capable of playing a larger role, quite capable of producing the investable models that could lead to scale up. What they require is that a longer period of capacity building, a more amenable capital to go to them, as well as enabling policy to work for that. So I'll stop here and I will kind of come back to the specific question later on.
And I have to find the unmute button. Thank you very much, Santosh. And we'll get into all of these things that you mentioned, especially the responsible investment into smallholders within this panel. I think what I wanted to say just very briefly is that it might seem that this panel is a bit biased towards Asia, even though this is the Asia-Europe Environmental Forum. But I think exactly what Santos just said, the sheer amount of food producers that we have in Asia that really has an impact all over the world. And if you include those food producers in Africa and Latin America as well, are so intimately connected to sustainable development and development in general, I would say, that I think this is something that we have to address, and it impacts Europe as well. So this is why sort of we've been focusing on this. Next up, I'd like to invite Cristina Igenta. She is the Deputy Director of Social Development and Governance at WWF Indonesia. And she's been doing that for 15 years and focused on strengthening and mainstreaming social equity and sustainable development and conservation with a focus on rights mobilization and local constituencies for natural resource management and sustainable development, indigenous people's rights and conserved areas, environmental governance, sustainable livelihoods, and fair economic benefit sharing. She also has a focus on local food systems, and I think that's the focus that we'll address today. And she's documenting traditional agricultural practices, biodiversity, food security, and food sovereignty from the perspective of indigenous peoples, but also looking at the role of women in rural areas, especially obviously Indonesia and within that Kalimantan. So Cristina, if you could give us a short sort of overview of what you're looking at before we go to the specific questions later.
Yes, thank you and good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be able to join this panel. And also, I think that the beauty of this panel is precisely the diversity of perspective that all importantly contribute to seeing and trying to understand this very complex system. So being based and having worked with WWF Indonesia for the longest time, it certainly obviously shows my bias, which is towards biodiversity conservation and so on. So that's probably the perspective that I will be talking to in the context with the food system. And I'll start off by saying that today, neither people nor the planet are in very healthy conditions. And we have a situation where agriculture and nature have entered a very unsustainable relationship. So we know that agriculture and food production depend on biodiversity and functioning ecosystem, but we also know that the dominant model in agriculture, and we're talking about industrial, high level of input, monocropping, and so on, is a main driver of biodiversity. We are talking about 60 to 65% of biodiversity loss due to the food system, 75% of deforestation, and 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions. So obviously the climate change exacerbates this condition. Plus, from a social point of view, we know that the industrial system has also caused more inequality, pushed small farmers to the edges of the system, where they often lose control of the production and the market, and often lack tenure security, which is a key issue and key asset in food production. So overall, I would say, I would call this kind of system biodiversity poor. It is very much based on the sense that you exploit natural resources as long as they're there, and not much afterthought on sustainability and long-term investment. But there are also different systems and different ways in which agricultural practices have been governed by others. And I'm referring obviously to the small scale farmers, but also, and among them, also the millions of indigenous people and women that have developed systems that are really quite opposite, very biodiversity rich, where agriculture is part of the agricultural cycle. It's not clear the way, but it's part of the cycle. And these practices are often more successful in terms of sustaining ecosystem functions and biodiversity, low carbon. Land stewardship is at the core of these systems, but also they ensure livelihood, well-being, cultural identity, food sovereignty, and also good nutrition. In way, many indigenous agriculture and food production system already achieved what the SDG 2 is about, therefore zero hunger, sorry. So, for example, one such system, I won't go into the detail, but is rotational farming, which is quite still very common practice in rural Southeast Asia. And then we also see that during COVID times, many indigenous people have revived their agroecological food system because that has granted more resilience and food security in this time of stress and challenges. So within the system, we know that women represent more than 45% of the labor force in rural agricultural-based economies. So the agency of women, the ecological and economic agency of women is very important and needs to be recognized and supported. They are also widely, traditionally, the seed keepers. So the many varieties of crops that allow for adaptation in times of climate change and so on depends on the knowledge of women. This is also refers to what many call for a transformation of food system towards more conservation-based agriculture, different terminology, or agroecology, but all of this follow very much systems that have developed over hundreds of years by indigenous people and local community. The other aspect that we look at is also in terms of supply chains, how this local food system have really shorter supply chains. And this allows for more equity in the sense of more economic value captured and retained at local level, negotiation for fair prices for both producer and consumers, and the possibility for producer and consumer to really interact and negotiate and therefore build more trust. I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Christina. And I think it's great that you pointed out that the panel is quite diverse. Good that you noticed, because that's how we planned it. And especially, I think I'm proud that we have private sector representation in the panel, and it's not just sort of the greenwashing type, I would say, but there's actually private sector that takes the issues that we find in unsustainable food systems quite seriously. So on that note, I'd like to introduce to you Andrew Powell. He's originally a biologist, but now he's the CEO of Asia Bio Business based in Singapore. Together, founded that company together with Professor Paul Teng in Singapore in 2005. And they do consulting generally on life sciences, but more particularly on agriculture and food sector. And their clients are both from the private sector as well as the public sector. I think I know that they work with the government of Singapore as well, but also with some quite high-profile private sector clients like Syngenta, Bayer, Tate, and Lyle. So quite some experience there, and Andrew, I'd like to ask you for your statement on the inclusive food systems.
Okay, thank you, Clemens. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here, and thank you for the opportunity. And let me echo the point that Christina made. It's great to be part of such a diverse panel. I was trying to be diverse in my points that I was going to raise in this, but as you're the last person in the line of 3 or 4 or 5, if you heard a rustling of paper, that was me rustling my notes together and throwing it in the bin, because everything has been more or less said already. So what do I say? Well, you know, we need to convey to the general population just how important the smallholder farmers are to our food supply. You know, we hear numbers of about 70% of the food being supplied to the global population through the smallholder farmers. When I tell my friends that, they go, huh? What are they? Who are they? What do they do? The message that we rely so heavily on the smallholder farmers isn't getting across to much of the urban population. And that needs to be conveyed to them, because then there'll be more value in those smallholder farmers. On the other side of the coin, though, the smallholder farmers are being pulled by the consumer demand. And I think Christina mentioned COVID, Erin mentioned COVID. That has accentuated the change in consumer behavior that we've been seeing over the last few years, where people are becoming much more connected with their, or want to be much more connected with their food supply, are demanding sustainability, are demanding ethical ways of producing of their food from their suppliers. So, you know, these are demands of the consumer that the smallholder farmer must also be aware of and must also work with. So it's a complicated environment where the smallholder farmers are doing such a great job in providing food, but in actual fact, if we're going to reach our targets for 2050, we're going to have to ask them to do even better. And to a certain extent, like all other farming systems around the world, the smallholder farmers have contributed to global warming and aren't as sustainable as they might be. They do have a lot of sustainable practices, but they could be better. So, you know, we have to find a ways to get more sustainable practices into the hands of the smallholder farmers, which these practices have to be scale appropriate, and they have to be gender appropriate, given so many of the female farmers, in particular in Southeast Asia. So we've got some real challenges ahead to really make sustainability such a key component of the smallholder farmer development. You know, there's a large group of smallholder farmers in Southeast Asia that we need to help become engaged in enterprise agriculture. Some people call them the subsistence farmers, but these folks are just able to make do and provide enough food for their own needs. We have to try to find a way to help them grow some more so they can enter the supply chain, the value chain, the food system, so that they can improve their livelihoods. That's a challenge that we need to do, and it's something I might mention later on if I've got time, but we really need to make a lot of effort in that. We talk about responsible food value chains. As everybody will tell you, the balance is all wrong. All the people who do the real hard work on the land, they're not getting the rewards that they should be. The smallholder farmers are not getting the recompense that they deserve. I think we are attempting to address that balance, because more and more companies farther down the value chain are starting to do the right thing. Some people say, oh yeah, it's just about money, it's greenwashing, etc., etc. But shareholders of these companies are now demanding that the companies that they have shares in do the right thing. And if the company's reputation is diminished or sullied by their actions, whereby the value is not transferred to the smallholder farmers or the people earlier on in the supply chain, then that company is going to suffer. So, you know, there is still an element of big bad business, but I think it is getting better. But we need groups around the world to keep pressuring business to ensure that they do the right thing and get that value moving down closer towards and into the pockets of the smallholder farmers who do so much of the work. I've probably gone too long, Clemens, but let me finish up for now.
Thank you, Andrew. That was right on time. We'll go into the questions now. And the first question we prepared for this panel is, what are actually the challenges for sustainable food systems? Why aren't they sustainable, right? And what are the policies at the moment? And some of you have already alluded to this. What are the policies that are preventing food systems from being sustainable? And also, what kind of policy change is required to make food systems more sustainable? Christina, may I ask, may I start with you, because you already started talking about some of the issues that you're looking at with the indigenous food systems and how more resilient they are. Can you, on the other hand, also talk about why you think that sort of non-indigenous or industrial food systems are not as resilient, perhaps?
Yes, thank you. I would like to say first that you started off with the transformation, and everybody's alluding that, and we all agree that we need a transformation in the food system, or make sure that things are more sustainable, more equitable, and good. We leave the planet for the next generation in a good state. So I think that one of the critical move is relocalization. And I'm not saying this in a sort of anti-globalization mode, not at all. But what I'm saying is, if we get it right to have strong local food systems, then upon that foundation, more global and more systemic changes in the food system and in the value chain can happen. I think it's extremely important, especially in countries where, and of course, I'm not Indonesian, but I've been based in Indonesia and can see the inequality and the imbalances between rural and urban, but between islands that are already well developed in terms of economy and other areas that are still developing, other islands that are still developing. And then you can see that if you don't work, particularly in an archipelago country like Indonesia, at the level of local places, landscapes and seascapes, to get the food system, both the production, the distribution, and the consumers, the buyers there at that level strong, the system will be vulnerable. There might be high yields, higher production, but fundamentally vulnerable. And this would cause things like food insecurity, loss of food sovereignty, and other problems that normally are not felt or experienced at global level or even at national level, but they are very localized. And the solution could also be very localized. I think it's important to rebalance between the verticalization of a global system based on, the capture and held by companies, the industrial approach, with the stronger horizontal scenario where you have local food system and traditional small farmers and indigenous peoples, communities contributing to making the entire system stronger. I agree with what Andrew said. This is no point in saying that every small farmer or the majority of them have necessarily always sustainable practices. That's not definitely the case, but there is a lot that we can still learn from those practices, from those systems, and take the best of it and how to integrate with innovation, more entrepreneurship, more investment, but keeping what makes those systems sustainable from the point of view of biodiversity, sustainable socially and culturally. This is an important point, because we often think of food security and we forget the aspect of culturally appropriate food, for example, and how the agricultural system sometimes imposes new crops, new resources, where other choices would have been made or were traditionally made by the communities. All of these aspects doesn't make the job any easier, but is important for sustainability over the long term. Yeah, I would stop there first.
Yes, thank you, Christina. And also yesterday in my introduction, I talked about how farmers have to be seen as not just merely food producers, but they're actually also repositories for culture. They are maintaining critical ecosystem services. They provide climate services through climate sequestration. So it's much more than just food producers, but obviously food production is also extremely important on a much larger level than just those local systems. Thank you, Christina. I have an announcement that comes from ASEF. Some of the people following our discussion here are actually logged into the wrong session. They're logged into the session from yesterday, the introduction that I just mentioned on inclusive food systems. But if you wanted to put something into the chat or a question into the question and answer box, you need to be logged into this current session. So today and the panel, not the introduction. Then your question or your chat comment will be read. All right. Moving on, perhaps to Andrew, you were saying that the shareholders are actually demanding more responsible and more sustainable investment into local food systems or with smallholders. Could you expand on that a little bit, and what's their motivation? Because we always, some of us obviously always assume that it's just the sheer profit that they're looking after, but perhaps there's also an issue with looking at these food systems and seeing how unsustainable they are. So yeah, my question is, could you please expand on that point?
Sure. Well, I think what we're seeing now is the issue of social license to operate is becoming much more of an issue for people around, for companies to do what they want to do. They have to have social license. And what they do must be accepted by society. And if they don't do what is acceptable to society, they lose that social license. They lose the ability to sell their product, and they lose reputation. Their reputation. And once they've lost the reputation, it's very, very difficult to get it back. And so it's important that the companies behave properly and are seen to be doing things ethically, sustainably. There was a great example just recently, not quite related to smallholder farmers, but a company in the US called Oatly, which makes plant-based milk from oats. It got into all kinds of trouble because it took money from Blackwater, which is it Blackwater? Well, from a company that is being associated with the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. So they had their reputation very, very badly impinged by the bad things that they were associated with. So, companies are becoming increasingly aware of that, and so are investors. Investors will not invest in early stage companies if they see that there's a risk that these companies will not have social license. So people want to have an assurance that the company is doing the right thing. So we want companies to do the right thing for the smallholder farmers right at the beginning of that supply chain and value chain within, within the food system.
Excellent. So there's obviously changes in what investors require as well. Apart from sort of I would call it the pressure from consumers, or perhaps, yeah, I guess it's consumer pressure that these companies are reacting to. Do you have the feeling, this is just a quick follow-up, do you have the feeling that investors also see the necessity for making food systems more sustainable, given sort of the drastic loss of some of the natural resources, such as soils or water, perhaps, and that they're quite aware of, because these companies often have very good data, that they're aware of some of the issues there?
I think that's the case. I mean, I think you're seeing money being raised by some of the venture funds, from the impact investment funds, really increasing quite a lot with people realizing that something's got to change. We can't go on the way we've been doing it. It perhaps is not moving as fast forward as people might like, but I think it is changing, and people are becoming aware of the need to do something different with respect to their investments. And some of the investors are prepared to take a long-term view. Other ones, I would call them widget traders, and they're not going to be trying to get involved in these long-term plays. But I think there are long-term investors who understand we need to do something about this situation where we have to support technologies that enhance the sustainability and enhance the longevity of our place on this planet.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I'd like to also ask Santosh about this, and especially, so obviously we've learned now that there's a demand for making food systems more sustainable, perhaps even more inclusive. How do we get there? You outlined in your introduction a couple of steps that we need to take. Perhaps you can expand on that. How do we support smallholders to get towards sustainable food systems, or more sustainable forms? Obviously, like Christina, I think, mentioned before, the goal is not for every farmer globally to become organic. Well, perhaps that is a goal, but it's a very long-term goal. But in the short term, I think every farmer needs to become more sustainable. So my question is, what are the steps for us to get there?
Thanks. I think if you allow me, I can just put a plug to what the discussion with focusing on impact investment and how that drives, because as Aviskar Group, we manage roughly around $1.2 billion in impact management, impact investment. And we typically invest across multiple kind of sectors, but agriculture has been one of the key focus area for us. And we have been kind of looking at a very thorough and broad metrics of sustainability and impact that we track when we do investment. But I think just a small pointer there, that unless and until we have the kind of customers or the larger ecosystem driving in the sustainability agenda, it would not go to the level that we're looking for. Firms like ours, while we do champion the impact investment and we are the kind of the leading firm there, but the amount of money going which is in non-impact sector is going to be critical. So the money that is flowing into impact investment is still minuscule compared to the money that is going into non-impact sector. So we need to kind of match that. Coming back to your question, and how we can make these small farmers or the sustainable food systems work and scale. So the one point, and Intellicap has been working with creating a big platform of almost 1 million smallhold farmers, and kind of working with them to move them towards sustainable food production and responsible consumption trend. And there, what we are looking at, we are having a four-pronged agenda. One is that if you look at the role of smallhold farmers in sustainable production, you need to increase their participation in value chain. Most of the farmers stop at kind of production, and then they kind of sell it, or the market takes care of that. localized production and localized consumption require that the farmers play a larger role in the whole value chain. They produce, they process, they take it to the consumer, and they manage the whole thing. And that would make it more resilient and more sustainable. One of the biggest footprint is the logistics in this space. So a lot of wastage happen because you move the food produced from the point of production to point of consumption. And it's a lot of footprint, a lot of vulnerability there. So the moment you start producing locally and start consuming locally, you take care of a number of points that my previous speakers have pointed out. So, but that requires a fair bit of systematic approach to do that, because the farmers are technically not trained to be the the entrepreneur that can take a larger role in the value chain. You need to work with them. A farmer who is producing, a fruit, if you want the farmer to be kind of producing jellies and jam from that, he's not trained for that. That requires investment. Otherwise, he would sell the fruit would move from a village to a main production center and then come back to the village as a jelly and jam that will they consume. Now, so one thing is that how you want to bring the innovation, technology, finance, and policy to support the farmers who are willing to play a larger role in the value chain, because the larger role they play in the value chain, the larger share of profit and margins they would have. So one of the things that we have seen that we are putting undue pressure on the farmer to be sustainable and to consider about all the responsible production and environmental factor, etc. And we are not worried about his or her income, which is already very vulnerable, getting affected by increased cost of production. So that's the larger point. Second point is that there's a huge amount of play of technology and finance in there. If you move to new technologies, new ways of, say, storing food, moving food from one location to another, processing food, you can make it more resilient. And when we talk about innovation, I'm not talking about the innovation happening at the industrial scale. There are lots of entrepreneurs, innovators who are having innovation that can be very, very small, and at a village level, at a small production center level, that can be done. In fact, we are promoting a number of innovations where the farmers can basically innovate at a small scale. They don't need to be the industrial scale. So the technology plays a huge role. And the last point I want to highlight before I come to the finance part, because finance is dependent on many factors, the customer awareness. While Andrew talked about the pressure on the companies to be more ethical, more right about that, but most of the companies inherently are not driven by ethics. They're driven by the market. If there is a market pressure, they would be ethical, and customers are in need of more data, more information before they make the purchase decisions. I can give you an example. Most places we have the calorie values on the food products. We look at the calorie values and say whether it's a fattening or not, whether I should buy it or not, because we read that. Think of labeling that talks about the environmental impact of the food. Think of the labeling that highlights the sustainable production. Think of the highlight, those would inform and make the customers aware. Now, if we have the technology, if we have the, the market, finance is easy to get, because once you see the finance coming back with returns, the more money will flow. At the same time, while we know that there is a need for money to flow, we need to make that the sector is such that it is giving at least a modest amount of return for those impact investors who are looking for that. And for that, we need the DFIs, the philanthropic foundation and the government to play critical role in supporting finance to make the market work. What I'm highlighting is that in the long run, this market can give good return, but you need to be patient. You need to fix the problems that are right now hampering this space. So finance can play a critical role, but I think that's the last part of the problem. The first part of the problem is that can you turn the smallhold farmers be more participating in the larger value chain? Can you create the local consumption system? Can you create the customer awareness? If these things are there, finance will flow.
Okay, thank you very much, Santosh. That's a lot to take in. So there's more customer awareness. I guess I would also add to your list perhaps training and capacity building for farmers in order to get to that stage of moving up the value chain, so to speak, and expanding their portfolio. And all this needs to be done responsibly. And therefore, I'd like to ask Erin, what are your ideas or Grow Asia's ideas on how to ensure these that these food systems become more sustainable, but also more worthwhile for the farmers.
Thanks so much. And as others have said, I'm really blown away by the diversity of opinion, but also just the sheer knowledge on this panel. So it's really fun to be here, and I hope everyone in the audience is also enjoying. But just to build off what Santosh just said, we know that it's really important to start from what incentivizes private sector, off-takers, buyers, retailers, and then work our way back up the value chain to be able to support smallholder farmers to shift their production models in order to really meet those changing demands for sustainable or traceable supply chains. But as my fellow panelists have already said, it's not fair to put that pressure directly onto farmers. And that's really where this approach of a multi-stakeholder partnership, where you're making sure that the public policymakers are present and coming up with creative solutions to getting credit directly to farmers. There's some very innovative examples around the region. The Philippines just launched Agripine, which is a program to pay out women farmers around the region, but in response to COVID. It's just one example of many, but what we're seeing as a multi-stakeholder platform or a network is that when we're able to link up say an impact investor along with an agribusiness that's interested in making a new investment, and then also bring in a traditional financier who sees maybe an interesting opportunity, that those are the kinds of examples where we start to see some real change for a large number of smallholder farmers. So I'll just share a little bit more about one program that I manage that Grow Asia is running right now, which is the implementation of a set of guidelines that were adopted by the ASEAN Ministers of Agriculture and Forestry in 2018. And those guidelines are meant to really inform how large-scale investments are made in Southeast Asia. And the guidelines are targeted at public policymakers, but we also have a section of the guidelines dedicated to guiding agribusinesses and a smaller one for financial investors. So we know that often guidelines at the international level are kind of beautiful words on paper, but are not often implemented on the ground. So Grow Asia has partnered up with several other international organizations with support from the Swiss government to take a 10-year action plan to really encourage uptake of these guidelines among private sector and public sector actors. So it's definitely a two-pronged approach. And what I'm hearing is feedback from our private sector partners is that investors are keen to understand what are the very local and regional challenges and barriers that they might be facing with their investments. So having this set of regional guidelines can really boost that. But they're also saying that we have a lot of investors in our network that are earlier in their sustainability journey. And so Grow Asia is looking to partner with many different organizations, whether that be certification bodies, standard setters, local CSOs and NGOs on the ground that have relationships with farmers, to really understand what are the local challenges and how can we support investors to understand what those challenges are, and then invest in capacity building for smallholder farmers so they can build an outgrower scheme that's successful and then feed that into their new rice mill as an example. So we do really want to see an increase in that connecting with local on the ground players as these investments are being made, but then encouraging those investors to follow these guidelines, which have a 10 thematic areas covering environmental, social, and governance areas. So we're very hopeful. We're at year 1 of 10 of this 10-year action plan. And we'll be working very closely with ASEAN member states to integrate the language into national policy frameworks. And then at the same time, working with private sector investors from SMEs all the way to multinationals to start to embed these thematic areas into their own investment practices and processes, with an eye toward improving smallholder farmers' experiences and incomes along those specific value chains. I also, Clemens, if you don't mind, just want to point to an interesting example of an investment in Vietnam. So I mentioned that GrowAsia has 6 in-country partnerships. One of them is in Vietnam. And we've had a very successful case study recently where over the last 4 years, our private sector partners, including Nestle and Yara, IDH from civil society, and the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Development have come together to create what's called the Vietnam Coffee Coordination Board. And that Vietnam Coffee Coordination Board has managed to put in place several policies, including removing VAT from green coffee in Vietnam, that is really impacting a greater and greater number of smallholder farmers on the ground. And so it's this coalition that is focusing on policy change, but also focusing on bringing the national sustainability curriculum for coffee directly to coffee farmers, where we've seen an uptake in good environmental practices among farmers. 4 or 5 years ago, we knew that program was really reaching less than 1% of Vietnam's coffee growers. But through this coordinated approach, where we have the National Vietnam Coffee Control Board and then local and provincial levels of the same program, we've been able to reach 18% of those coffee growers. And the coffee growers are taking up these good environmental practices through the National Sustainability Curriculum because they are seeing their costs lower. They're using inputs more efficiently, they're using water more efficiently. And so they're actually seeing an incredible savings of over $12 million at aggregate annually as a result of taking up these practices. And this is 50,000 farmers in Vietnam. So it's just another example where we see investment, and the total investment was 17 million USD into these private-public partnerships across Vietnam to implement this sustainability curriculum. And majority of that investment came from the private sector, but we also saw a lot from public sector partners as well. So bringing back to the way that these kinds of investments can really have a very real impact on smallholder farmer livelihoods.
Thank you, Erin. That's a great example. I would like to refer to the point you made earlier, and perhaps ask Christina for maybe a bit of a dissenting view. I'm not sure, but we heard from Santosh and Erin that it's important to bring the investors and the farmers together, for the farmers to scale out, to move up the value chain, to get trained up, skilled up, in order to be a more active participant in the food value chain. Christina, when you look at indigenous food systems, those systems are not initially designed to be scaled up, right? They're supposed to be local food system and ensure local food sovereignty and food security. Is it even possible to work with these indigenous food systems? Is a bit of a tricky question, maybe, but you know, these these traditional food systems, indigenous food systems. How do you invest into them? How do you skill these farmers up that were, you know, in food systems that were not initially designed to reach beyond the immediate community? So I just wanted to get your voice before we move on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you. My simple question is, yes, it's possible. Of course, the willingness of the communities and the farmers being involved, and the challenge that Santosh talked to about, they need, if you want to bring them up higher in the value chain, you also need to invest them in and help them and support them with capacity building, innovation, and so on. So that is definitely there. In other words, I would also call it more like, I think Andrew mentioned that, rewards. Instead of talking about only incentives, but rewards for what they are doing right. And I think these rewards are not only economic. I mean, there is a wider set of values that come into play. And one is, when we are talking about indigenous people, is tenure security and access to land and their resources. because that's, if we documented across 4 provinces in Kalimantan, and where you have small community in the interior, 40 to 60% of their food intake comes from the forest or other ecosystem. It's not necessarily cultivated. So it's that wild food that we refer to is very important, but it's also part of the cultural identity. So it's a lot of things that we can look at in terms of reward, but it's certainly possible. And a couple of small examples, not as big and at scale as Erin was talking to, but interesting enough is how the women, again, being a major force in rural economy, in particular agricultural practices, have come together to organize small local markets. And at those local markets, they only sell their produce that comes from their seeds, and they are being trained on internal control system to ensure that that could go for certification of that particular market, if that at one point is possible. But that immediately has rewards in terms of prices, in terms of customer trust, and incredible surge in income for them, so they can, you know, send their kids to school, they can be trained for higher education and so on. So that is a positive example of what you exactly were asking about. I mean, you are grounded in this local system, but there is openings, there are opportunities when there is the willingness to also pull out the potential of all this system, paying attention to the various dimensions of it, but it's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I think that was an important point. So maybe if I may add, perhaps sometimes working with indigenous farmers, indigenous food systems, we have to be even more responsible or even more careful, because there's I think you alluded to it, a lot of ecological and traditional knowledge that is proprietary to these groups and need to be safeguarded against exploitation, obviously. So I'm assuming, Erin, these things are also in your guidelines.
Yes, absolutely. I was just going to say, and I'm really glad that Christina brought this up, that one of the guidelines is very much focused on how to engage Indigenous communities, but it's also a thematic area that runs throughout, along with women and youth. But also that the 4th guideline is all around respecting land tenure and encourages, or rather insists, that investors use a free, prior, and informed consent process. And some of our partners in the network have some fantastic tools for investors about what is FPIC and how can I use it when I'm doing my due diligence process. So I think it's incredibly important that all of us in this ecosystem are really focused on these kinds of consultative processes that ensure rights to all of the community members involved.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make sure that we still have that in there, because we're talking about inclusive food systems as well, and that's definitely one part of inclusivity. Moving on to the next question, and I'd like to start. I'd like to call out a male participant first to respond to this question. We were asking ourselves, what's the role of women farmers in driving a more responsible and inclusive food system, and how can, by emphasizing this role or by furthering this role, this lead to a more sustainable consumption and production in terms of food systems. I'd like to ask Andrew his view on the role of women, and whether the private sector is even paying attention to that or not. Unmute, please.
Sorry, at least in my part of the world, the issue of the female smallholder farmers is certainly one that people are taking into account. I think in broader terms, we do need to get the message across that women farmers play such a major role in agriculture around the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia. One of the things that we're involved with at the moment is developing a center of excellence, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative where with Bayer, IFC, DFAT Australia, Circa, Murdoch University, SEI, and people like this, who are all geared towards affecting change in the smallholder farmer community. And the women farmers are a definite target in that. We want to ensure that if we are going to impact smallholder farmers with technology and improve their lot, the technology has to be scale appropriate, but it also has to be gender appropriate and fit in with the demands that the women farmers are placed under, because often they are only the sole workers of the land, perhaps with 1 or 2 children. So, definitely we need to keep focusing on the women smallholder farmers of the region, and it is something that industry is well aware of. I don't think the global community outside of the people around this table and all the other people at this meeting, it's not very well appreciated. But their role is incredible, and the different things that the women farmers do and they're much better custodians of the land, for example.
Yeah.
It has to be appreciated, and their value appreciated as well in broader terms.
I was just going to say, Andrew, when we look at more than beyond food systems, but multifunctional land use, the role of women even becomes more important as far as how they're contributing. Erin, you mentioned you had some type of project at Grow Asia that you were that was looking into these kind of things.
Yeah, thanks, Clemens. So Grow Asia, we've been around for 5 years, and we've always had this explicit focus on smallholder farmer households. And we encourage our partners to think about ways to empower and support those households. But in the last few years, we've had a lot more of our private sector partners, as well as, of course, NGO and CSO partners saying, we need to start looking more carefully at the specific role that women are playing. And the great news is that there are so many existing toolkits and frameworks and methodologies to really understand in specific value chains, where are women participating? What is their role? Do they have access to or control over resources? And what is their power and agency in terms of decision-making and participation at the community level? So Grow Asia's been working this year to develop a gender mainstreaming strategy. And the strategy, because we're a network, is really aimed at how we can distill and then share the business case for focusing on women smallholder farmers across our network. Not that that's the only important piece, but we would like to see greater private sector investment being driven specifically to those sectors where women play a very strong role, or even directly into women that are perhaps field staff or at the kind of organization or corporate level within our partners' own systems. So we just actually are wrapping up a gender landscape mapping study, and we have case studies from 15 partners around the region. And I'm completely impressed by how much our partners already know about how to reach those women, but also that piece around the business case. Our partners already know that women are often their best customers and clients. So women, in many cases, make financial household decisions. And so they're deciding which inputs to buy to put into the farm, and which products they will or will not choose to engage with. But we also see examples where women are increasingly picking up roles as aggregators and providing very small scale credit to their surrounding farming communities. So some of our partners are trying to understand how they can really bolster that existing community of women sales agents, if you will, to also lift up other women farmers in those value chains. there are many, many different examples that we're seeing around the region in this space, but I think understanding the important role that women play, but also again, to Christina's point, that there are different culturally appropriate examples of how women do or do not engage or are not included in decision-making that need to be taken into account in each location where any organization really wishes to engage more women in their value chains.
Thank you, Erin. And also, Christina, Andrew mentioned the fact that women are actually very important custodians of the landscape. So from a conservation point of view, women smallholders, what is their importance?
Is it to me? Yes.
Yes, please.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I think everybody, Erin, Andrew, made excellent points earlier. So I would just add that more specifically land stewardship, but also all the issue around agrobiodiversity. So the seeds, the knowledge of the seeds and the preservation of the local seeds and local varieties is by majority of cases is women's knowledge in rural community, in indigenous communities. So that needs to be understood and preserved. So any intervention that would exclude the women would exclude also possibility to adaptation to climate change and other major adaptation of crops and other major action. That is extremely important. And this is also linked to another aspect where women are the main decision makers in the family, and is around food choices in the family, and keeping and ensuring that good nutrition and good diets are available. So they have an incredible knowledge about what the different variety species that they collect, they cultivate, and so on, would bring to the table, so to speak, actually concretely to the table, and what kind of good nutrition, good diets they're able to provide for their families. That is a very important aspect. Plus, in many cases, we see that women are eager to participate, are eager entrepreneur in many cases. So food processing, I mean, talking about higher role in the value chain, to food processing, small restaurants, small things, it would be a obvious extension into the system that women could really lead on. That's what I would add. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. And if I could stay with you for a moment, we're now moving on to the questions that we have received from participants. We have at the moment 120 participants attending, so it's really good attendance. And we have a bunch of questions that we received. So if I may, I'll be a bit selective on what questions to focus on. But one of the questions, Christina, this for you, that came up is on land tenure and land tenure security. And I know that you mentioned that just earlier, especially in regards to indigenous, but even non-indigenous. I think this is a critical issue, as smallholders need to be able to manage their own resources and have sort of secure access to their own resources. Could you say something about the whole issue of land tenure and how it is related to sustainable food systems?
Yes, I think you said it all, actually. The importance, you described very well what the importance of tenure security in this. But if we look at land, and I think everybody would agree, as an asset, and we spent some time earlier talking about the good land stewardship at the core of sustainable small farmers food system, then tenure security comes in logically and naturally, in the sense that if you are secure of your asset, you would invest in your asset, no matter what your asset is. And continuity and sustain of that asset is what will sustain and maintain your other of your operation. So it's really, this has been proven when there is access security, tenure security of some sort, people will take better care of their resources. In many cases, in the indigenous communities, we are not going to go into the politics of this, but in principle, it's the same system. What they believe is their territory, their area, they will invest in it. The moment there is a different interest coming in and encroaching and conflicting with their priority in their land, then it's gonna there's gonna be conflicts. There's gonna be a cost, social, economic, and ecological cost. We know that. So it's security comes in as an investment in sustainability, basically. And that it works at every level, especially for small farmers and indigenous communities.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. I'd like to keep going with the questions, and there's some really fascinating questions, maybe even very future relevant questions. So one of the questions we got was, given that more people now living in urban areas than in rural areas, from a sustainability perspective, does it make more sense to promote lab-grown foods that are closer to consumers? Sorry, because we've been talking about rural areas, land security, conserving natural resources, so on. Why don't we just disrupt the whole thing and move the food systems into the urban areas? Maybe Santosh first, and then Andrew. Santosh hasn't said anything for a while.
No, I think these questions, I think we have been discussing the indigenous farmers and sustainability and other dimensions. So I think, see, it's very, very risky to talk about technology and future, because, you know, you have a big risk of being wrong. But I think in principle, if the concern is that we need to grow the food in lab because it's closer to the urban consumption system, I think, you have to consider multiple factors. What we are saying is that the global footprint of food is not like, you know, that you move from one city to another. It's like one continent to another. If you look at the food movement there. So if that is your concern, you can still be better off by having 100-kilometer radius of food production where you still produce rather than in a lab. But I think if the technology has to play a role, it can play a role in multiple ways, and not only by playing a role in producing the food in lab. You know, so what we should do, that we should think of technology to be helping the indigenous farmer, the sustainability, and the people who are engaged in the sustainable food chain, rather than trying to disrupt and make them completely think of what need to be done to those people. So I will, you know, park my response here.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very good response. Andrew, you also wanted to respond.
Yeah, I think there is some merit in having your production closer to your markets, but you know, we're talking pretty sophisticated and very expensive technologies there, and you know, in Singapore we're talking about vertical farms a great deal, and you know, right now it's borderline with respect to profitability for the production people, and it's very expensive. It's only in your relatively high-tech grocery, or your high-priced groceries. There is some in the more local groceries, but it's relatively in short supply. You know, if you start talking about cellular agriculture, well, then you're even talking about you know, off the planet expenses. You know, we're still at $80 a kilo for lab-grown meat. So I think there's some way to go, and most of the companies there are only talking about commercializing in 2023 or 2024, and then it's still going to be expensive. So, you know, if we're addressing the economic access dimension of food security, I think we've got a long time to wait.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And we actually have maybe a related question. which is that the pandemic strengthened the role of digital technology, disrupted some of the markets, including definitely also the food system. What do you think of the role of digital technology in the food system? How can it sort of disrupt the traditional food value chain? And is there a need to systematize or regulate the food system in terms of the introduction of digital technology? I might add perhaps that in one of the previous conferences, I was very fascinated to hear about how blockchain can improve the transparency actually of the food value chain. So there's definitely also positives in introducing this type of technology, but it doesn't have to be. Erin, maybe?
Thanks, and welcome others to jump in as well. But Croatia does have a digital ag tech program that was launched a little over 2 years ago, really because we recognize that our private sector partners are looking for digital solutions to do many different things, improve traceability, to get direct payments to farmers, to address advisory services and make those more accessible, and then things even as kind of large scale as drone technology. So we recognize that there are many different types of ag tech solutions out there that many startups and governments are trying to make available to farmers. But the thing I'd actually like to highlight here is that, yes, of course, the pandemic is highlighting that we'll have to do more and more virtually, but that does not mean that smallholder farmers are adopting that technology, and it does not mean that the technology is being designed for those farmers. In some cases, it is working, but we just published a report back in March and then an addendum in June to show how very few smallholder farmers from a sample in Indonesia and Vietnam are actually taking up the many different mobile apps and technologies that are being made available to them, in some cases because they don't have internet access or they don't have data. In some cases because there's a single smartphone in the home and someone else is using it. In some cases because it doesn't make sense to use a smartphone out in the field during the rainy season, which is when they need those advisory services. So there's a whole series of barriers specifically for farmers to actually taking up that technology. And the last thing I'll say is just that we heard that there's also a lack of trust. So farmers are used to going to each other and building on that peer network to address their challenges and to solve problems. And we're seeing that trust of the technology isn't there yet. And we probably have quite a way to go, but really focusing on trust, peer-to-peer networks and farmer-to-farmer learning may be a better place to start when we're looking at ag tech specifically for smallholder farmers.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Maybe okay, Andrew, you want to, yeah?
Yeah, could I just illustrate a point that Erin made, which is a very valid one? You know, the farmers of Southeast Asia are probably the most digitally disconnected farming group around the world. You know, in the latest FAO report, Actions to Transform Food Systems Under Climate Change, they have about 66% of the smallholder farmers in the region not digitally connected. And that contrasts really heavily really badly with the South Asian farmers, who are much more likely to be digitally connected. And you can see the way that the ag tech digital world has impacted the ag tech community and agriculture in Southeast Asia, because there's a lot of activity in India around digitization. And all the you know, digitization in general, all the companies are embracing that in some shape or form.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I just wanted to mention that in order to balance things out perhaps a little bit, I'd like to ask Christina, looking at you know, the sort of the opposite side of the spectrum, maybe organic farming, maybe things like the slow food movement. Those are sort of very analog type of food systems rather than digitized food systems. Can we learn from those as well? And do they have a future as well, next to all the sort of the fancy technology, the drones and the digital systems and so on?
I think so. I think so. And there is a beautiful challenge to take on. The balance and the integration of this new. So finding really the balance between tradition and what works in tradition, not just tradition because it's tradition, but what seems to work, and innovation, and implant that innovation within a strong sense of traditional values and practices, I think is the way to go, really, because otherwise you sort of push small farmers further away from the system that is moving fast in a different direction. And so even when you talk about online and digital trends, what Erin said, and Andrew confirmed, is really true. So in many areas, you don't have access to continued good access to internet, even in Jakarta, by the way, where I'm based. Sometimes I just wait all of a sudden to be disconnected. It's working so far. And that's true. Or you have access, you have phones, because in terms of numbers of phones, everybody has a phone. But how can you use that phone for? So there are maybe different level of connectivity that you can create. So for example, during COVID, online orders by simple, WhatsApp group worked very well, and work even in local markets and with local producers. So when we're also going back to the question earlier about the urban space is not just unilaterally an urban space, especially in a great metropolis area, is a combination and integration of rural communities and spots within a more advanced technologically, economically world. So how to integrate better this for making it work for integrated food system within a larger urban area? There is a lot that could work in that direction there. I think it's absolutely possible, and the eagerness, that's the other thing that we need, the psychological, the behavioral aspect of all of this, is there is an incredible eagerness on the part of the small farmers, on the part of women, to really to try something new, to innovate, but of course, on the basis of being respected and recognized first, that I would say. Back to you.
Thank you, Christina.
Can I just add one quick thing here?
Yep.
Christina, I was just reflecting on what you were saying, and I absolutely agree. I mean, when we're looking at what seems to be working is where we see some farmers being able to access e-commerce platforms. There's a great example with a company called Pinot Duo Duo out of China that has made their platform super accessible to farmers. And I encourage everyone to take a look at their model. And we see the same thing, that farmers want to participate on these platforms, but this is where the role of regulation comes in. We need to see policymakers looking for innovative ways to bring in the private sector that can deliver these solutions, but actually make those solutions accessible by extending broadband internet and leveraging pools of funds that they may already have in something that's called universal access funds to actually invest in that infrastructure. So just wanting to bring back in the role of the public sector here.
Thank you, Erin. And if you don't mind, perhaps you can post a link to this company in the Huva chat so that everybody can access it. That would be great. I want to switch gears a little bit. Oh, Santosh, but I actually was going to ask you another question.
No, I think just
go ahead, please.
One point on the digital thing, because we have invested in a number of companies in digital space. I think the one point I want to make that they are not at war with the traditional system. Sometimes they can enable those farmers to be more, beneficial. I think the one point that we have been talking and we have not touched upon, the digital technologies have enabled a number of new options for farmers, including the development finance or result-based financing, which enables you to get paid for environmental benefits you generate, like you enrich the soil, you reduce the carbon footprint. These digital technologies and innovation in monitoring and verification has enabled that money to flow to the traditional farmers. Because keep in mind that traditional and indigenous farmers, by virtue of the way they do their agriculture, they generate more climate benefits than anyone else, and they are not being rewarded for that. So these digital technologies, the blockchain, which reduce the duplication, can basically enable them. So it's not always a conflict of modern versus the traditional. Sometimes they can all work in sync.
Yeah. And somehow you read my mind, because that was exactly the question I wanted to ask about. It actually was also mentioned in the question. So payment for ecosystem services. Andrew talked about custodians of the landscape or conservation as well, which can be done with or without digital technology, but perhaps verification and even new approaches like participatory guaranteed systems, guarantee systems are being experimented with. Is that something that is also worth investing in? You know, beyond the food production itself, the question that we got from the participants was actually particularly on soils, and that got me thinking. Well, agriculture obviously needs to lower its carbon emissions. Carbon is sequestered in soils. So we need to improve soils, not just to produce more food, like Andrew was alluding to before, but also to do our bit for the climate. Can we find a system, whether digital or not, to reimburse farmers or to incentivize farmers to do that?
So I can quickly answer to that. I think if you look at the recent development in the technology, which are kind of allowing you to understand the soil health and kind of monitor the improvement there. Because earlier, while we are talking about soil health, and most of the time when you want to pay for the environmental benefits, you need to have a baseline and showcase that there has been improvements. And the soil health is the kind of bedrock of many of these sustainable production systems and other things. So the payment for environmental systems is going to be huge going forward, considering that we will start measuring these environmental benefits. And with the technology, with the ecosystem that is there, we can pay for those benefits directly to the farmers. And that I see a big game changer, because that would allow the government and the DFI and many of the philanthropic foundations who are trying to build the ecosystem to directly reward for creation of those benefits. And that would enable a more number of farmers to come and engage in environmentally healthy practices of production.
Yeah, thank you, Santosh. One last question was about, I guess this is a segue into the upcoming session on antimicrobial resistance. But obviously there is a lot of, within food systems and sustainable farming systems, we also need to look at this issue, especially in food production, as we also ingest those what they call the anti what's it called, that what we ingest? Antibiotics, that's the word. So we heard about this antimicrobial resistance building up in the food system. Does anyone want to respond to this very quickly?
I can give you a quick response. I think there's tons of studies that talk about how the pesticide, insecticide, antibiotic, even the plastic goes into your food chain, So this is a real menace. And there is a report which I was looking at, that in a month, you consume plastic worth like a small credit card, and forget about the kind of antibiotic resistance you are building. So the cleaner way of production, the sustainable, responsible way of production is going to be huge, considering the health and other issues that are popping up. I'm talking from Delhi, where the pollution level is so that we are kind of affecting our immunity levels. It's a 700 air quality. Now, globally, the push on these benefits, that how the health need to be protected, how we need to be consuming healthy, would drive these practices. Because as we get more aware, we see the transition happening. And that's what I was talking about. Consumers, once they have access to more data, more studies, and more kind of information, by nature, they would start saying that it's not about just consuming for the sake of consuming, but it's consuming while protecting your health and etc. So I think this is a very, very big concern that emerging with the existing food practices, be it at a production or consumption level.
Okay, thank you, Santosh. And I think more will be talked about in the session on AMR. I would like to ask Asif now to bring up the mural. And as I ask the panel for their sort of concluding or summarizing statements, perhaps we can also look at the mural. I'm not sure if Asif is listening. I hope they are. And if you could bring that up in the Huva. And perhaps look at first quadrant first. What are we going to keep in terms of policies that support inclusive and sustainable food systems? But while we're looking at, so I'm asking a lot of you now, panelists, looking at the mural and the various ideas that came from participants and concluding statements at the same time, as I'm afraid we'll otherwise run out of time. So if any buzzwords look familiar to you, you might allude to them. Otherwise, just perhaps give me your takeaway as to what you heard today and what was confirmed and what was perhaps something new that you learned. And most importantly, what should be in our joint policy statement. Who do I start with? Any volunteers? Andrew, thank you. Okay, it's up, yeah.
Sorry, I think there's some really interesting points made on that mural. They're all very, very specific tasks or changes. And one of the things that I think we must take into account and must add into this is the sociology of change. We need social science involved in all of this. We're changing a lot of people's lives, and change brings about angst and concern. And we have to realize how we manage that angst and concern and how we communicate that. There's a lot of, we do a lot of work in risk communication around innovation and the changes and the angst and concern that innovation brings. A lot of these things are going to change people's lives, and changing people's lives is not that easy. Not everybody embraces change. The innovators embrace change very easily, but they're a sort of a group to themselves. So if we're going to impact people's lives, we need social scientists to help us understand the people better that we're going to change the lives of. We've seen programs in Africa where social science helps effect the changes that are needed. We need to do this. We need to think about the same things in this diagram as well. We also need to keep banging on about partnerships, but we also need to create partnerships to affect the changes in the complexity of the agri-food ecosystems. And because no one player can do that on its own. So we really need to embrace SDG 17 on this, which is all about partnerships for change.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I see here in the keep section, we talked about some of these things like local markets. It says local vineyards for consumption and wine production. Sure, that'd be great if we had that everywhere. Local producers supplying local restaurants. So essentially shorter transport distances. And also fresher food, I guess that it means that as well. Organic compost made from waste. We talked about a bit about food waste, and I talked yesterday about post-harvest losses that are quite substantial, and that are sort of in the way of this constant push to produce more rather than looking at the losses that happen post-harvest. Asif, if we could move to the improve section on the right-hand side. And I'd like to call on Christina, who is waving her hand.
No, oh, sorry. No, maybe it's in the proof. Sorry, I just glaringly in the green side, there isn't anything about women specifically. So maybe that's something to be improved. Okay, never mind.
Yeah, definitely.
That was.
Well, I would say the improved women part should be in the improved section, right? Because
Yeah,
the green
and
one
hopefully
was key.
landing. Okay. Yeah, who knows? There may be already regulations and policies concerned with gender sensitive and gender responsive budgets, and those exist and those should be kept and improved in other areas. That would be just one example.
Yeah, that's great. So what we have here in the improved section is price control on organic food. So I guess that it doesn't become too expensive. Awareness and access. We talked about that a little bit, about the more aware the consumers are, the more pressure they can put on as shareholders on the companies to invest responsibly. Again, encourage consumption of locally produced food, promotion of alternative farming methods, hydroponics. Andrew, I think you're right. Some of these are very, very specific, but some of them are also very needed, like better infrastructure in rural areas so that produce can reach urban centers and consumers quicker and therefore more fresher. May I ask Erin perhaps to give your summary statement and what you took away from this panel?
Yeah, thanks so much, Clemens. And one thing just to say quickly about the mural here is I do think these are important points, but again, to take a step back, when we're looking to affect change at scale, we have to see certainly a network of all of these changes happening, but also make sure that any of the solutions that we're developing are not only developed with the end consumer in mind, but also informed by what's going on in rural communities and what do smallholder farmers need. So I think that's the thing that I heard come up again and again in the panel today. We've shared many different ways that we can invest in smallholder farmers, pay them for their services, make sure that we're recognizing and acknowledging their role in protecting biodiversity. But I also just want to point out that, as with that example I shared from Vietnam, when we reduce the cost of production for smallholder farmers, they have more income and they will start to make decisions that make sense. And the decisions that make sense are more sustainable, environmentally friendly production systems. So I think really bringing it back to that point is incredibly important. And we see in the Grow Asia network more and more of our private sector partners trying to really understand what are the pain points of the farmers and their supply chains and specifically addressing those problems. So I would love to see that again in a disaggregated between men and women's experiences as well in those agri-value chains, but really wanting to drive that point home about making sure that we're thinking first and foremost about smallholder farmer challenges and then engaging the right players, to Andrew's point, and making sure that those actions are led by partnerships, not just by a single actor or a single sector.
Yeah, thanks, Erin, and you're absolutely right. I mean, these are obviously snapshots or ideas that we receive from participants. I guess it's upon us to flesh them out. And the whole of systems approach is, I think, very, very relevant. Christina.
Just a simple one before we were moving to the blue area, back to the yellow bit. It's about improving certification systems. And I think it's very, very important because that's the link between producers and consumers. And if we want consumers to take on as Santosh said in the beginning, about to take on the price of sustainability too, is also how can we make certification system work better? And there was a reference earlier to PGS, Participatory Guarantee System, which is something that policies and government could support better, for example, because it's more accessible to small farmers and so on. So just to flag that, thanks.
Excellent. If we could move back to the lower left. scale up. Can I call upon Santosh for your take homes and whether you see anything in there that you can relate to?
Yeah, I think these are quite comprehensive, although I think we have to kind of put them in kind of right kind of phrasing, but the suggestions are good. I think the larger point that we are all making, that the partnership, and when we say the partnership is critical here, because the partnership between the civil society, the smallholder farmers, the corporate, and the government need to come together. So what I need to see is in the scale up part is that how we can bring more partners who are complementary and can work together, because often I have seen many examples, corporate playing a big role in taking the smallholder farmers to a better production system because they start investing in them. So they're not all kind of thing that where we can ignore the corporates or the private sector there. So and the other part in the scale up for me would be that, scale up the focus on pricing environmental outcomes, positive or negative. See, while we talk about a lot of thing about rewarding the the benefits, but we also start kind of penalizing the damages, because things that look cheap are not cheap. They come at a huge cost of environment, and if you start factoring them in, the sustainably produced things would look far better. And I think that would say that how the policy regime can be created that basically stops the damages to the environment. And I think land use change, a number of things that we have not touched upon, could be a very, very valid point here. So for me, I think the take home is that if we focus on a partnership, we focus on the environmental benefits and start pricing them right, whether positive or negative, and we bring together innovation and entrepreneurship, we should be able to scale the sustainable food production and consumption there.
Okay, thank you, Santosh. And for those who are watching on Huva, I'd like to point out that the names have been jumbled up a little bit. So if you're watching our session, I'm the one on the top left corner. That name's correct. Next to me on the right is Aaron. That name is also correct. Middle left is Santosh Singh, not Omar Kaing. Omar Kaing is the panelist that couldn't make it today. Middle right is Christina Igenta, and lower left is Andrew Powell. Okay, so the names are all correct, but they're jumbled up and allocated to the wrong people in Huba. So just that we make sure that this is rectified. If I could ask Asif to move to the lower right corner with the mural. So what we want to get rid of, and this is really open to anyone now because I believe I've asked all the panelists already. Although Christina, you sort of jumped in, so I didn't give you the chance to officially give your take homes. But perhaps you can relate to this a little bit. Too much government involvement, conversion of agriculture in favor of real estate, creation of new supermarkets, sugar and palm oil, plastic packaging, junk food. Anything that you don't want to discard, or is this all fine?
Maybe junk food and stuff like that is personal choices too. It's important to inform people about what is good for you or not. And that brings me to that. Maybe the junk food and sugar and all that should be phrased under the issue of health. And as mentioned earlier, I think it was, I don't know, Andrew Santosh, but it's very important that kind of incentive interest that people, consumers have. For many little big fairs I participated in with farmers trying to sell directly their products, including slow food networks and so on. It's always there. The utmost concern of consumers and buyers is about the health effect and impact of what they buy, more than ecological biodiversity. That's already a different level, but health nutrition. It makes me feel good. It makes my body heal. That's very important. It's fundamental. So I would discard policies that, you know, don't take, I don't know how to phrase it in policy terms, but no incentives to that kind of food production and distribution. It could be more neutrally put that way. That would be certainly important. And too much of government involvement, I'm not sure, because that depends on the policies. We cannot just lump all the governments together. And here in Indonesia, especially in terms of food and agricultural production, I've seen enormously valuable, innovative, courageous decision and policy making by subnational governments at the level of district and province, really betting on improving and transforming the local food system and protecting traditional agriculture. So, and organic farming and so on. So there is a lot of that going on. I think it speaks mostly to the thing that we should improve, actually, which is what was mentioned earlier about this multi-stakeholder, multi-rights holders platform. So government are very well into those platforms too, beside private and the farmers.
Yeah. Thank you, Christina. And Andrew, you also wanted to react?
Well, I was just going to sort of work along the points that Christina mentioned. You know, you've got to think that if you're stopping people, encouraging people not to eat sugar, which is good, you don't want to do, and maybe palm oil, which, you know, is out there as well. You know, you're actually taking livelihoods out of some of the smallholder farmers that we're trying to support. So, you know, if pass the buck on to somewhere else and let the consumers make the decision. Give the chance to farmers to make some money. I mean, there was a great example in the UK a few years ago when people were complaining about the trimming of green beans so that they fitted in the package nicely. And then I saw some guys in Kenya were being paid to do that. And when the controversy was risen in the UK, all these people lost their jobs. So, you know, it's complicated. You know, one solution somewhere in one place, you cause another problem somewhere else. So, you know, you can't, you've got to be careful what you ask for.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, and I think that's also a really good point, that it's not just about the sort of first world consumer, but it's also about the producers and how they can be sort of uplifted. Just as you may, you know, palm oil is getting a very bad rep at the moment. But like, if you look at the situation here in Thailand, for example, all the palm oil is produced by smallholders. So it doesn't have to be universally vilified. But certain production systems are definitely detrimental, both to the environment as well as to the producers. All right, I think if there is no urgent need to speak more by the panelists, I think we can wrap this thing up. We've reached our time. I think we have had an excellent session with a lot of a huge wealth of knowledge, as somebody has stated earlier. Thank you very, very much. Thank you also, Asif, for rectifying the names that has occurred now. So you're all out, your pictures are now allocated to the right names. So you could be identified in the future. Thank you very much, Santosh. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Erin. And thank you, Christina. Thank you very much for the Asif team over in Singapore and the SCI team here in Bangkok. And I will send out, at least to the panelists, but also to Asif for further distribution, the policy brief that we will produce together. And I think that could be a very, very powerful statement coming from so many different different partners, right? What's this? Sorry, I don't understand this. I'm receiving notes, but I don't understand it. So I think we can move over to you, Fatima, thank you very much, and I'll close this panel now.
Thank you very much, Clemens. Thank you indeed. So we are running ahead of schedule, which is a good thing. And at this point, we will initiate a 15-minute break. So on our end, it's 5 p.m. basically. So and then we will start the next session on sustainable garments at 5:15 p.m. 5:15 p.m. And then I would invite everyone to please go back to the agenda section on Whova by clicking on show agenda and click on the next link. And it would be a different a link from this one. So it is important that all our participants transfer room. And in the meantime, in this 15 minutes, we will prepare with the next set of speakers in our backstage, and we will be back with you shortly. So everyone, we invite you to have a coffee or to chat with other participants and to continue networking and explore the other Whova functions. And we will see everyone at the next agenda item, sustainable garments at 5:15 p.m. Singapore time. Thank you very much.